And the first one is James KIRK Eisenhower versus the State of Florida. Counsel ready, sir? You may proceed.
Good morning, Your Honor. Greg Tucci from Ocala, Florida, representing Mr. Eisenhower. I would like to reserve 3 minutes for rebuttal. This is a case...
Excuse me just a minute. Let me change that. Okay, you have now 3 minutes for rebuttal. Thank you.
Obviously, this case involves a grand theft. Our position is the grand theft statute in this case was read in Parametera with Section 22187, which we've challenged for the first time on appeal. And part of the basis for that challenge I'll come to because of the cash decision. Quickly, the case involved CTC funds, which are corporate tax credits, an SFO run by Mr. Eisenhower received from Pulte Corporation. These were supposed to be used to fund scholarships for needy children. There was a mechanism in the statute that allowed for that to occur. Because of misunderstandings with the registrar and the principal, they decided that the rules did not permit them to...
There was testimony that he tried to give the money back
Yes, sir.
to the corporation that originally gave it. Did he try and do that after he had spent part of the money and after the investigation started, or before?
I believe that would have been after at least part of the money was spent, and I believe it was after the investigation was started. Basically, the state...
Let me interrupt you for a second.
Yes,
I'm having a little bit of trouble from the record understanding the relationship between Cambridge, Silver Archer Foundation, and Mr. Eisenhower. Give me a dynamic on how this
Mr. Eisenhower and his wife, Ms. Nahas, founded Cambridge Academy, a recognized and licensed long-distance learning school back in the late 1970s. Ms. Eisenhower, Nahas, ran that school for quite a while, and then they changed the rules as to how she could participate. That's how the new registrar and the new principal became involved. In the meantime...
That's why there was no cooperation between the two in terms of the delivery of students.
Yes, sir. Basically, and so in the meantime, several years preceding the CTC scholarship program, Mr. Eisenhower set up a Silver Archer Foundation, which was just there. And then when the program became available, he applied for funding. Basically, the state concedes in some degree that Cambridge may indeed have been a worthy institution, and it awarded administrative or tuition-reduced scholarships.
Let me get back to the investigation. How did the investigation start? Who was the one that filed the complaint or notified the authorities to get them to investigate in the first place?
My recollection is it was either the Palm Beach Post or a Fort Lauderdale newspaper when I was doing an investigative series. Investigated a number of these SFOs, investigated one down in St. Pete where they got all the money and bought themselves houses and cars and what.
So the entity that paid the money in the first place didn't complain.
No, sir.
There's no one from the academy that complained.
No, sir.
And there's nobody from the state of Florida that complained. It was a newspaper.
Yes, sir.
All right.
So basically, one of the critical issues are the statute wasn't followed, but the record substantiates that hundreds of thousands of dollars, probably equaling what we'll call the Pulte money at $268 or $270, scholarships were awarded by the school nonetheless.
Did the school ever receive the money?
Yes, sir, it did. But the statute says you're not supposed to use it for operational. Well, let me put it this way. The statute says you can't use it for operational or administrative expenses directly. But if the registrar and principal followed the mechanism, found the same students who got the tuition reduced or administrative scholarships, found them, sent the voucher or sent the check to have the parents sign, and then it's deposited into the academy can do everything that was done anyway. The state basically says, well, we're claiming no harm, no foul, and to an extent that's true.
So give me a timeline here on what happened in sequence. He gets the money from the private business.
He gets it. Yes, sir.
And then what happens?
Then it's deposited. Cambridge Academy, though, is in a bankruptcy. And the Internal Revenue Service is starting to make some waves about trying to get the Pulte money. So Mr. Eisenhower is trying to stay away from the Internal Revenue Service and get the money eventually in the Cambridge Academy. And that is done through a series of transactions.
Okay, now but he gets the money,
Yes, sir.
the students are recruited,
They're recruited under normal recruitment, but not under Section 220-187 procedures.
when does the investigation start relative to the students being recruited?
I want to say the investigation started some 6 months later.
Okay. After students are recruited. When was the investigation started relative to delivery of funds to Cambridge by Silver Archer?
Again, 6 months after the fact. So if this started in March of '03,
Right.
I think the investigation was September, October of '03.
Okay, and when was the money delivered?
The money was delivered in increments from, I believe, March '03 through June or July '03.
Okay, so the investigation began after the delivery of money?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And the expenditure of those funds by Cambridge was when, relative to the investigation?
Throughout that whole period of time, and maybe even subsequent to the commencement of the investigation.
When was it? Is it like $7,000 or $8,000 that was used for furniture or something for Mr. Eisenhower? When was that? When did that transaction? And how did it occur?
Well, that's probably, in my opinion, the worst thing that he did. He hadn't been getting a salary. So being a CEO of one entity and a CFO of the other, and I may have those reversed, he said, well, I'll buy myself some furniture. It would have been, and I'm not sure if it was May of '03 or June of '03, but it was in that time frame.
Was it before the investigation began?
Yes, yes, sir.
All right, I think I have a picture. Thank you.
Okay. Basically, what's happened is, as we set forth in the initial brief in the Walls case and the Bush case, the CP funds are private funds. They're not government money. They're not owned by the state of Florida, any agency, or the Department of Revenue. That's true even today. It was true when Mr. Eisenhower received these funds, and even the scholarship, the CPC policies on scholarships today conclusively says tuition vouchers are government money, private funds are not. We have then the cash case, which the state brought up, and the cash case is the one where the gas retailer collected gas tax. He was convicted. He challenged the conviction. What piqued the appellate court's interest in that case was, one, the issue of proof, and two, did the state have an interest in the funds? And the cash case said, certified a question, if the state doesn't have a possessory interest in the funds, under the facts of that case, didn't that constitute fundamental error? They certified that question along with another question, but the Supreme Court said, no, these are government funds, so they never reached the other question.
So from an earlier comment, you said with respect to the expenditure on furniture that was the worst thing he did. Do you agree that rises to the level of a grand theft?
I'd be hard-pressed to. I don't really want to agree with that because I think the other issues.
I disagree with.
I think the other issues would say no, because if they're not state funds and a grand theft hasn't been proven as set forth in issues 2 and 3, then it doesn't matter. And the irony is, under the statute, you see, the same students were qualified. The cross-examination, it took me forever to drag out of Danaher and the other witness to finally concede there was no prohibition of them finding qualified students, and there was no prohibition of awarding scholarships to part-time students, which were the grounds they continually used to say that's why we didn't cooperate. Even they had to admit that the school awarded almost $300,000 in scholarships to needy children via tuition-reduced or administrative scholarships, which we suggest clearly met the statutory scheme. It's just that the mechanism to do it wasn't correct. Then we get to the issue.
So under that theory, Robin Hood really wasn't stealing from the rich.
And I think this court maybe addressed that in the new decision of 2005, that theory came up. No, he wasn't stealing from the rich. And in fact, the statutory scheme was being met. I mean, when you say, did he receive the money with an intent, a preconceived intent, we suggest no, it was in good faith that he received it. When he spent it, which eventually awarded the scholarships, was that a theft? Well, I think what belies the argument of a theft is even the hostile witnesses, Danaher, principal, agreed he was putting personal funds in to keep his school going.
He being?
Mr. Eisenhower. The testimony unrebutted was he sold an airplane and put those funds into the school. Unrebutted testimony, he sold a yacht or boat and put those funds into a school. That's not the action of a thief. And that's why we say that the evidence doesn't support the premise that there was intent to steal. And then you couple that with 812 in paramaterial with 221.87, and that's where we get to the fundamental error issue. With regard to issues 3, basically, there was no proof anybody, any identifiable entity, agency, or person had an interest in these funds that was superior to Mr. Eisenhower's. They can't be government funds under Walls and Bush and even their own policies. That's what the information says. That's what was argued to the jury. So I think under that premise, there is a lack of competent substantial evidence to show an ownership interest in anyone else. Thank you.
May it please the Court. My name is Chris Davenport, and I represent the state of Florida. Even Robin Hood was a thief. He might have done good things with the money, but he stole it.
Let me get to the issue that's bothering me, that's giving me some trouble, and that is the issue of intent. Mm-hmm. And if we look at the facts of the case, and I think you tell me if any of these facts are incorrect. That Silver Archer was put into existence to act as a scholarship funding organization a year prior to these alleged offenses. Eisenhower solicited funds for the specific purpose of scholarships through Silver Archer. He obtained funds from Pulte. He actively and repeatedly attempted to locate qualified students and attempted to actually force the academy, the employees of the academy, to find qualified students. You disagree with that?
I disagree that he did anything active, and here's where the problems arose. I think it's certainly supportable by the record to argue that when he first got these funds from Pulte, he intended to comply with the statute. Mm-hmm. So he gets his Silver Archer is a separate corporation from Cambridge, the school. They're two separate corporations, right. Separate offices. They don't share employees. He didn't want to hire employees for Silver Archer, it seems to me, because you can't use the scholarship money for administrative expenses. When he first submitted his application, he had 10% for administrative expenses on there. The person who was going to approve it said you can't do that.
But the point is that there were employees at the academy that he had a difficult time cooperating with him in his search for qualified students. You would agree with that, wouldn't you?
I agree that he tried to get them to do that. They felt that would be wrong, though. They said they don't solicit for scholarship funding organizations. Those are separate corporations, and they wouldn't do it for him.
Matter of fact, the evidence was pretty clear that he was pretty upset about the fact that he wasn't getting cooperation from the academy and them trying to assist him in finding qualified students. I mean, the evidence showed that, didn't it?
It showed that they refused to do that, and that upset him.
And then he actually refused to certify that he had used the money as required because he hadn't. Then he contacts the various state agencies and departments and asks, what am I supposed to do? We can't find the qualified students. I've got this money. And he didn't contact them and ask them for...
Let me put that in the context of the time frame now. He didn't certify it after the investigation started. He called Pulte and said, you want this money back after the investigation started.
What
This
did
was
Pulte-
after he couldn't document. They asked him for documentation of scholarships. He couldn't provide it. This was after the furniture spree. This was after he knew he was in trouble at that point.
Okay, but in any event, I mean, he tried to solicit advice from the various state departments to find out what to do with the money, and they didn't know because they thought it was a relatively novel situation and they'd never heard of it before.
Well, after the investigation
Okay,
started and he
after-
got caught,
after
he
the-
tried to give the money back, which was already spent, by the way, but he would have brought it from something else.
And then he contacted Pulte and tried to give the money back, and they wouldn't take it back.
Right, because they didn't want to get involved in this because they were.
But
part of the
what was he supposed to do with the money? I mean, if he accepts the money, can't find qualified students, the academy won't cooperate with him, he's got this money, he calls for advice as to what to do with the money. No one can give him any advice because they've never heard of the situation before, and he tries to give the money back. Although the investigation had already started, he contacts Pulte, wants to pay it back, and they say no. What's he supposed to do with the money?
Well, here's the thing, though. He had already spent the money improperly.
Oh,
Then he
on
gets
what?
investigated.
On what?
On direct operational expenses.
Not all of it.
Not all of it. By the time they finally finished it, he had like $5,000 left in the Silver Archer account. He had spent a significant portion of that money before the investigation started. He got caught. He was like, uh-oh, how do I give this back?
But wait, I thought Mr. Tucci said that the vast majority of that money went to Cambridge.
The vast majority of it did. It had already been spent before the state started investigating it.
By Cambridge.
By Cambridge.
Okay. So if it was supposed to go for scholarships, which would have ended up in Cambridge's pocket anyway, what's the point?
Let me stop you there. Not necessarily. Because this is scholarship fund. The Silver Archer had nothing to do with Cambridge, except for it was owned by the same guy. They were separate entities. The way the statute was set up, it was to give needy kids the opportunity to go to private schools if their public schools were failing. So Pulte didn't give the money so that kids could go to Cambridge. Pulte gave the money so they could get a tax break, honestly. They gave the money so needy kids
Well, so
could go.
who's the victim here?
The victim is the Department of Revenue because he didn't follow the...
When were they owed, Department of Revenue, I assume you're saying that they were owed tax revenue. When were they owed the tax revenue?
They were owed the tax revenue from Pulte.
When?
Pulte,
Well, they gave Pulte the tax break, didn't they?
right, that's why
All right.
Pulte's not the victim.
And so if they gave Pulte the tax break, Pulte didn't want the money back, and Mr. Eisenhower wasn't spending the money on himself except for an expenditure of some furniture, and was selling his airplanes to try and keep the academy afloat. Pulte didn't want the money back, and the department gave him the tax break anyway. You're saying the department is the victim in this case?
Right, because that was what the money came from. Was it was supposed to be paid as corporate taxes. The state set
So
up this limited program.
Why isn't there relief against the donor, the person who made the contribution to Mr. Eisenhower?
Well, the
Why
reason,
don't they get their money from Pulte Corporation?
because Pulte didn't do anything wrong. They didn't steal any money. The state certified this.
Counsel, excuse me for interrupting you, but the problem with your case is that if you concede that the department had no interest in this money,
I don't concede that.
well, they had interest in it in the form of corporate taxes that they would have collected otherwise. But during the time, the dates that are alleged in the information, they certainly had no interest in that money. It was a future interest, but not a present interest. But you charged the defendant in this case in the information with certain dates. And the corporate taxes weren't due until December 31st, 2003, which is outside the time alleged in the information.
Well, they paid
So
quarterly.
you charged him with a crime, and the dates that you got on your information don't correspond with the reality of the situation.
They absolutely correspond, because Pulte was going to just make these contributions as their quarterly taxes became due. Instead of doing that, Mr. Eisenhower called him and said, really, kids are falling through the cracks, we need this money right away. She said, fine, I'll pay my taxes early. If I pay my taxes early, I can't go get him back and say they don't belong to the government anymore. The Department of Revenue clearly was out this money because they got a tax break for money that wasn't spent.
And they didn't have to give Pulte the tax break. I mean, if the money was illegally spent and Pulte wouldn't take the money back, they didn't have to give Pulte the tax break, but they did it anyway.
Well, the reason they gave Pulte the tax break was kind of a clean hands thing. This was an approved scholarship.
That's not the point. The point is not whether Pulte had clean hands. The point is whether there was a crime committed at all.
Right.
If the Department of Revenue had relief at all, it wasn't against Mr. Eisenhower, it was against Pulte, because they didn't get their taxes.
But Pulte didn't steal the money.
Wait a minute. That has nothing to do with whether or not this was a crime. If they would have charged Pulte with taxes, Pulte would then have had a right to go back against Mr. Eisenhower. And there may have been a crime, but that's not what happened. Pulte didn't take the money back, and DOR didn't charge them taxes for the amounts not paid. So
Right.
I'm having an awful difficult time understanding what the state's theory was.
Here's the theory. They set up this scholarship funding stuff for a very limited purpose. It wasn't corporations can get this dollar-for-dollar tax credit for giving money to private schools. It wasn't broad like that. It was, here's this specific procedure. We're going to give it to you for this specific purpose. You have to find certain students
We all agree.
and give them scholarships.
I don't think there's any argument.
That's how you got the corporate tax break. So Pulte gives the money to an approved scholarship funding organization. It turns out the scholarship funding organization is used by a thief because he doesn't give the money to scholarships like he said when he got the money. He didn't go to Pulte and say, look, there's this thing, you can get a tax break. I'm not going to actually find kids because that's kind of a pain. I'm going to just use it to keep my school afloat. He said, I'm going to follow these rules. Pulte gave the money in good faith. It was a certified scholarship.
But if Pulte found out, or Pulte knew that the funds weren't being used for the designated purpose, they should have taken the funds back, and then the state of Florida would have been able to collect their taxes. Instead, Pulte knew, or should have known, that these funds were not being used for the proper purpose because Eisenhower was calling people wanting to know what to do, even though the investigation had already started. And then he called Pulte and asked them to take the money back, and they said no. Why? Because they wanted the tax break. And then now you're saying...
Wait. Let me make it clear how the time frame worked. Because this whole I wanted to give the money back thing, I know it makes it seem like he was just confused. He was caught with his hand in the cookie jar. He said, uh-oh, I need to give this money back. Pulte was like, we're not getting involved with you.
Well, at that point, if Pulte knew that the money was not being used for the designated purpose, they should have taken the money back.
The money was gone.
Well, he offered to pay it back, and they said no.
He offered to pay it back. He didn't have it anymore.
Well, wait a minute.
He wasn't going to give this money back.
How do we know that? There was never an opportunity for him to prove that he could pay it.
Because he kept telling, when he first got investigated, he told the state, if there's a problem, I'll pay it back. And that was the last anybody heard from it.
Well,
all the money was spent. There's extensive documents in the record. They charted where this money went. It was gone. It was spent. This school was in bankruptcy. He was selling his possessions to try and keep the school afloat. This money was spent. And you can't steal something and give it back anyways. That doesn't eliminate the fact that you stole it. If I go in and steal a shirt from the store, I can't say, oh, I got caught. Here, you can have it back, and it's not a theft anymore. He had already stolen it. That goes to intent, but that's a jury question. And the jury heard all of this. Oh, it was so confusing, and my employees wouldn't cooperate, and all of the sob story. And they said, here's this guy who went through this complicated process to become certified. He couldn't get his employees to do his job for him, so he was like, forget it. I'm just going to spend the money because the school needs it. I'm going to ask my employees to make up schedules for students who don't exist. I'm going to buy myself a house full of furniture. I'm going to ask them to make up student IDs for students who don't exist.
I'm guessing $7,000 is not a house full of furniture.
Pardon me?
I'm guessing $7,000 is not a house full of furniture.
Well, maybe from Keynes it might be. He said that's the worst thing he did. I think that illustrates his intent, though. He saw this as free money to use as he saw fit. if Cambridge is a good school, that's great. But Robin Hood was a thief. Just because, he was trying to keep his school afloat, if you steal money, even for a good cause, it's still stealing. If you offer to give it back at the end when you're caught,
What if he hadn't spent the money and he calls Pulte and says, we can't find the students. Pulte doesn't want the money back because they want their tax break. And he calls the department. They don't know what to do with the situation. What's he supposed to do with the money?
if he had
kept it or spent it, what's the difference? It's still in his possession, and
But
Pulte
it's
doesn't
not
know
his to spend. It wasn't given to Silver Archer to spend as he saw fit. It was given to Silver Archer to find certain
Okay, but
scholarships.
let's assume he didn't spend any of the money, and it was just sitting there. Pulte didn't want it back because they wanted their tax break. The department wasn't going to force him to take the money back, apparently. They gave him the tax break anyway. He calls the state agencies. They don't know what to do with the money. What's he supposed to do with the money?
Here's what should have happened. When he saw that he couldn't afford to hire employees for Silver Archer, he didn't want to find the students himself, even though he said he was going to. His employees weren't going to cooperate. Here's what he should have done. Look, I called Pulte. I'm not going to ask for more money. He was asking for more money early throughout the summer. He should have called Pulte and said, look, I can't find the scholarships. I can't do this. I'm not going to certify the funds. You can have them back if you want, because if I don't certify them, you're not going to get the tax break. Instead, he called Pulte. He said, we need more money. There's needy kids out there. Pulte said, where's our certification?
Well, he didn't.
I'll get it.
He didn't certify. He didn't. But they got the tax break anyway.
I think that was a gift from the state because Pulte acted properly. They didn't have to give it to him under the statutory scheme.
Your time over?
Unless you want to ask a question.
Well, I'm still troubled by why the Department of Revenue, who gave a gift, would be the victim. I mean, if they were the victim, why would they be giving a gift to Pulte?
Because the money should have gone to the Department of Revenue because it wasn't spent under this.
And all they had to do was say, Pulte, it's time for you to ante up the money.
But that would have not been fair for Pulte.
Wait a minute.
They
We're
were
not
trying to be
talking. We're
nice.
not talking about whether it's fair to Pulte. We're talking about whether this man committed a crime.
Right.
I'm having a hard time seeing who the victim
In a
is.
sense, that Pulte was the victim. The state was trying to help him out.
Yeah.
But they became the victim by
Thank
doing
you.
it. Thank you.
Susan, you've got 3 minutes, or you can flip while you're...
I just want to touch on a few things, Your Honor. Ms. Zukoff was quite clear that this was not quarterly tax money. Sometime in 2004, when Pulte's taxes were done, a tax liability may or may not exist.
Who's Ms. Zukoff?
Zukoff was the representative of Pulte who testified at trial, and she basically, so in essence, if Pulte owed $400,000 and that was determined in 2004, they would get a tax credit for their donations in 2003. I mean, during the trial, the state kept saying it was a sales tax, and we had arguments over that.
Clearly it was not a sales tax.
No, they finally agreed that it wasn't a sales tax. And while I might agree with the state's contention that my client's a thief, the problem is Cambridge, through its earnings, through his personal contributions and the Pulte funds, gave scholarships to needy students who would have and should have qualified under the statutory scheme of 22187 had the employees of Cambridge not bucked the system and said it's not our job when there were no prohibitions against it. So, again, it's not like he's buying himself other than the furniture, cars and going on trips and using this money personally. It's all gone back into the school. The school awards the scholarships, not the statutory scheme. I don't think that's fairly categorized a Robin Hood defense. I think it belies any indicia of...
Was there any evidence that the money went into his pocket and then he wrote a check for furniture, or did it was a check for the furniture come out of the school?
It came out of the school or one of the accounts he was using to keep the money away from the Internal Revenue Service. He didn't want them to get it, obviously, because all this kind of came up at the same time, and he's kind of scrambling. But no, I think it all went from the SFO to either to Cambridge or an entity, and to Cambridge, and then was used. And I believe that's how I can't honestly say about the furniture, that specific check. But I think under the circumstances, there really was no crime committed, and the goal, for lack of a better word, of the statute was in fact met, and if there was a personal benefit, it was the $7,500 or so of furniture. But I'm not sure, given the other points we've raised, that even that would constitute a criminal offense in this particular case.
Thank you, counsel.
Thank you.